Shalom, everyone. Continuing our series, Spiritual Geography of the Land of Israel. Last time, we dedicated virtually the whole class to understanding what we'll call the eastern border of Eretz Israel. We did especially the Syrian-African rift, the connection to the whole story of Sodom and Amorah, the Dead Sea, the lowest place on the face of the earth, rising up to Yerushalayim, which is considered the height of all of the mountains. Then we followed the Jordan River up north, around 200 kilometers, to the Sea of Galilee, also below sea level, and even farther to the three sources of the Jordan River, the Don, the Banyas, and the Snir, all the way up to Mount Hermon, the tallest mountain in Israel, 2,236 meters tall on the Israel side. Remember, the Hermon is a range, and Israel does not have control of all of it. In Syria, it rises to 2,800 meters, which is 9,232 feet. And it is like the sentinel of the whole north. On clear days, everywhere up north, there is the Hermon mountain. And that's where we ended. What I want to do today is we are going to start with Mount Hermon. And then what I want to do is I want to do a kind of survey of the whole rest of the land with lots of details. And then in future classes, we will just pinpoint a few of these places. So today is going to be, for those who are familiar with Israel, we're going to get a kind of like a bird's eye view of the whole land and many, many special things about it. And then in the future classes, in which there's really only going to be approximately 3 more, we will go deeper into some of the more spiritual aspects. So we're going to start with the Hermon. That's where we ended last week. And so here I want to mention, as I said, since it's the tallest mountain in Israel by far, it is snow-capped a good amount of time in the year. And because of its just presence up north, it's mentioned 12 different times in the Tanakh in different places because it's so special, it's so unique having a snow-capped mountain in Israel. So it's mentioned 12 different times in the Tanakh, twice in the Chumash, both in Sefer Devarim. And that's when we also conquered the eastern side of the Jordan River. That's where we call the Golan Heights now. And these were 2.5 tribes, Reuven, Manasseh, and Gad, dwelt on the eastern side of the Jordan River. And so in the book of Devarim, when those lands were conquered, Mount Hermon is mentioned twice. In the book of Yoshua, when they're conquering the land, it's mentioned 6 different times. And here we're going to read 2 different places in Tehillim where it's mentioned, one more in passing, and the other one, it has a very prominent part, and that's the 133rd Psalm. We're going to read it in a second, but I just want to mention that along with Mount Hermon having that name, it has 2 other names also, and it appears in the Tanakh. Sometimes it says Mount Hermon. This is Sion or Snir. Those are the other names for it. Sneer was in ancient time the Canaanite name for snow. Sneer, snow. They're obviously connected in English. And so really Hermon has three different names. The other one is Sion. So in the 133rd Psalm, I'm going to read it in Hebrew and English. It's one of the Song of Ascents, one of the Shir Hamalot. And it's a very short one, but a very, very beautiful one. And it's really connected to the spiritual geography of Eretz Yisrael. So it says like this, Shir Hamalot LeDavid, a song of ascent to David. Hine matov u'manaim shevet achim gam yachad. Very, very famous verse in Psalms. How good and how pleasant it is for brothers to dwell together. I'll come back to that in a minute. Kashemen atov al harosh yored al zakan Aaron. It's like the oil, the good oil on the head of, in this case, Aaron, as he's being anointed to be the Kohen Gadol. And this oil that runs down his beard, the beard of Aaron, sheyored al pi midotav, that then continues to flow onto his garments or his personality characteristics. Midotav, midot is one's character. And then it says, so here we have this vision that it's so good for brothers to dwell together. That's Moshe and Aaron. All the commentaries say it's talking about Moshe and Aaron. And what is this oil dripping down? This is the oil of his being anointed Kohen Gadol. And according to the Midrash, it's poured on his head, as it says in the Psalm. But some of it like rolled down onto his beard. According to the Midrash, just 2 drops. And then those also went down to his garment. And that Aaron was actually very worried about this because the anointing oil was considered very, very special. And he was worried that it should have stayed on his head. And the fact that it rolled down to his beard and then to his garments, he thought maybe it was a waste. But Moshe comforted him and told him that not to worry about it. It's natural. But here, just you see Aaron, he over a drop of oil that might have not been in the right place, that he was concerned. He wanted to get it right. But then listen how the psalm concludes. So in other words, this oil running down from his head to his beard, to his garments, kital Hermon, like the dew of the mountain of Hermon, sheyored al Hararet Sion, that runs down to the mountains of Zion. Ki sham tziva Hashem et habracha, because from Sion, God has placed a blessing, Chaim ad holam, everlasting life. So here it's very, very significant that the anointing oil of Aaron to anoint him Kohen Gadol, high priest in the Mishkan, is compared to, here it says tal, the dew, but we learned already that the sources of the Jordan River are coming from the Hermon. And so here the tal really represents the water of the Jordan flowing down all the way to the Dead Sea and to the mountains of Zion. Mountains of Zion is Yerushalayim. And so we learned last time that this very, very spiritual connection between the lowest place on the earth and Yerushalayim, which represents, even though it's not the tallest mountain by any means, but in relationship to the geography of Eretz Yisrael, it sits at the top. And the land falls all the ways down to the Dead Sea, to the lowest place on earth. And in the other direction, it falls all the ways down into the Mediterranean. And so here, the Hermon is like the anointing oil. Why? Is because to this day, Israel is very dependent on the rain. In earlier days, it was completely connected to the rain. Now we have desalination. And so we have another source of water in the land of Israel. But still, rain is still very, very important. And so here we're seeing that the Hermon is the provider for really most of the water in the land of Israel, especially in the Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee. And then it flows down to Tzion, and that's where the bracha is. But here we see Mount Hermon represents the source of the physical bracha and also the spiritual bracha. Now I want to mention, it says like the dew of Hermon. The word for dew in Hebrew is tal. Tal equals 39. Here in this psalm, it's talking about the oil that's running down Aaron's beard. Shemen is 390. 10 times tal equals shemen. And that's why in tradition, dew and shemen are considered very, very spiritual liquids. The tal is which gives life to so much of vegetation, especially in the summer here where there is no rain. And so many plants depend on just the tal, just the dew. So that completes our learning about Mount Hermon. So again, what we're going to do now is we're going to travel together from the north of Israel all the ways to the south and get a feel of the land, learn some of the names connected to certain of the verses in the Torah, but all in a relatively general way, a survey. So since the Hermon is the most north of Israel, we're going to stay up in what's called the Galil. The upper Galilee the root is Gal. Galil, a Gal has many meanings, but one of them is a wave. In the Mediterranean or in the ocean, waves are called, is a Gal. A circle is a Gal. A wheel is a Gal. To reveal is Gal. Gal einai v'abita niflaot mitoratecha. Open my eyes. Gal means like reveal to my eyes wonders from your Torah. And hopefully by now everyone knows that I'm writing a weekly article in the magazine called Wonders, Rabbi Ginsburg's organization, and it's named after Gal Einai. So the whole northern part of Israel is called the Galilee. There is what's called the Upper Galilee, Galil HaElyon, that runs all the ways up to the border with Lebanon. And then there's what's called the Galil HaTachton. The Galil HaElyon, the mountains and the hills are much taller, more grandiose. The lower Galilee is more, we'll call it hilly. And so that is a good part of Israel. The northern part of Israel is the Galilee. So probably the most important, at least from a biblical point of view, city in the upper Galilee is Tzfat. And anyone who's been to Tzfat knows that, first of all, the word Tzfat comes from the idea of to view, to see a horizon. And Sopheh means also to look. Someone standing guard and making sure the enemy isn't coming is like a Sopheh. So Tzfat is named after this idea that it's perched on this mountain with a beautiful view of the upper Galilee. And especially right across from it is Har Meron. Meron comes from the word merom, which means high up. The part of the Hermon that Israel rules over today was in the Golan Heights and was not part of Israel until 1967. So until 1967, the tallest mountain in Israel was Har Meron. And it's directly across from Tzfat. And it's just perched like just beautifully there. In between Meron and the mountain that Tzfat stands on, there is a valley called Wadi Amud. A wadi in Arabic means a valley. And there is a very, very famous trail that I did at one time. And many people do it, who live up there do it all the time. But you can walk from Tzfat through Wadi Amud, and you have to go way down into this valley. And at the bottom of the valley is a river. And it runs all year long. And then you walk along the river bank all the ways to the foot of Mount Meron, and then you climb Mount Meron. And I can't remember, because you stop along the way because there's just so many beautiful places. But if you would walk without stopping, it would probably take 2 to 3 hours. But most people stop where the water is and, take their time. So a lot of times people take 3-4 hours to walk from Tzfat to Meron. Very beautiful, incredibly beautiful. So that's important that we're learning the names of these places, what they mean. So Tzfat, again, means this overlook, this beautiful view. And Meron is where, is based on this idea of this high mountain. On the top of Mount Meron is one of the most important radar stations in Israel. The whole top of the mountain is army. And this is one of my favorite hikes in Israel, because the top of Mount Meron, it comes to like a peak, and they have what's called the Peak Trail. So the army and all these radar stations are perched right on the top, but right below it, there's a 360-degree trail that it's just magnificent. I do it every year because you can see the view in 360 degrees. And because you're far up, you can see all the ways to the Hermon. You can see all the ways down to the Sea of Galilee. You can see into Lebanon. It's just absolutely beautiful. And I take, I don't know, an hour and a half to do it. But if you didn't make any stop, you could do the whole thing in like 45 minutes. So that is just really, really one of the best views in Israel, because you can see in literally 360 degrees and you're walking around it. It's just absolutely beautiful. In Meron, at the foot of the mountain, is buried Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So along with it having been the tallest mountain in Israel until we got Mount Hermon. Now we have to understand, why is Mount Hermon mentioned 12 different times in the Tanakh? Because in ancient times, it was part of Israel. It's just between 48 and 67, it wasn't. But traditionally, it was always part of Israel. The whole Golan traditionally was part of Israel. Good part of what's called Jordan was part of Israel. Those 2.5 tribes, they settled there, Reuven, Manasseh, and Gad. It was part of Israel for many years. In fact, they have found more ancient synagogues in the Golan than any other place in Israel. It was very well populated. And we're talking about synagogues from 2,000 years ago. So that is, I didn't talk about the Golan so much, but I know that they did a survey among Israelis. What is your favorite part of the country? It's a vacation. By far, the Golan won. It is just absolutely beautiful. It has a lot of water. Last time I talked about Tel Dan and about Banyas and the Nachal Yehudiah. And in the winter, there are many, many little waterfalls. It's just absolutely, absolutely beautiful. And so approximately 6 years ago, there was a tremendous tragedy in Meron on Lag BaOmer. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai passed away on Lag BaOmer. And so it became tradition in Israel to try to go to his gravesite on Lag BaOmer. My wife and I went approximately 49 or 50 years ago. And we stayed all night. There was maybe 20,000 people there, which is a lot of people. And people camp out for a whole week. And there's music and davening and cookouts and davening at dawn. It was an amazing, we stayed up all night. It was an amazing experience. But as each year went by, more and more people started coming until it peaked at around 500,000 people coming during the 24-hour period of Lag BaOmer. And 6 years ago, because kind of everyone knew that there was trouble, because the site wasn't made to hold that many people at once. And so unfortunately, there was a stampede that started accidentally, and it was so packed and people started to fall, and the momentum, it was a tragedy. 43 people died. Now, this has never happened in Israel before. Actually, you read in different Muslim countries, this happens all the time, that they have these small shrines and tens of thousands of people come. And almost every year you read about these stampedes where up to hundreds of people get killed. This is the only time it, as far as I know, that it happened in Israel, and it was quite tragic. Now they limit the amount of people who can be there at once, and they redid the whole place. But it was kind of like a tragedy waiting to happen, and it happened. Anyways, that's Meron. The northern Galilee runs right into Lebanon. I think I mentioned that many countries, or let's say states in the United States, there's natural borders, usually rivers. It could be a desert, it could be a mountain range. But in many countries, the natural borders create the real borders. The upper Galil runs right into Lebanon. It's just a continuation. And that's why in ancient days, the whole south of Lebanon was part of Israel. For thousands of years, it was part of Israel. So there's no natural border there. It just continues. Now, of course, there is a border, but geographically, there is really no border up there. Okay, now, because I want to get through the whole land. Part of almost the kind of like the border between the lower Galil and the upper Galil is where Tiberia is. Tiberia is the one city sitting on Yam Kinneret. As I said, it is below sea level. Yam Kinneret is approximately 210 meters below sea level, 685 feet below sea level. So the whole city of Tiberia starts at the sea, and then it goes up this tall mountain. And so the top of Tiberia is way up here, and it just goes all the way down to the sea. Now what we're going to do is one of the most important geographical elements of Israel. And I pointed this out before. Let's say this is the Mediterranean, and let's say this is the Dead Sea. And again, this is very general, but from the north of Israel all the ways to the Gaza Strip, there is what are called the plains, the Shfela, the low area. In most places, it's only 6, 8, 10, 12 kilometers, but it's flat virtually the whole way along the Mediterranean. There are many places in the world where you have a sea and you have these steep cliffs, but in Israel, it's flat land all the way from the north, which is called Rosh HaNikra. Rosh HaNikra is the most northern, where the Mediterranean is, and it does have a very unique geographical element to it. They have white cliffs. I think in England you have the white cliffs of Dover. Well, here in Israel, we have everything. That was our first class. Everything that you have all over the world is in Israel also. So Rosh HaNikra is very beautiful. It's the plains, but then you just go up a bit. And so you're standing in Rosh HaNikra, you could look out for like down into Israel, like 50 kilometers. And these beautiful white cliffs. And in the cliffs, there are what are called the grottos. That there are these caves, and they've made like a walking path through these caves, and the water is entering into the caves. It's very, very beautiful. It's not huge, but it's kind of like a must-see in Israel. As you go into these grottos, and the water is crashing against the rocks as you're walking through. Very, very beautiful. So here in the west where the sun sets over the Mediterranean, it's flat the whole way. We'll get back to that. It's called the Plains of Sharon. Okay, now, so here again, you have the flat area, and then you have the Dead Sea down here. And basically, the whole country goes like this, to this ridge up here. That's where Jerusalem sits. But now we're going to go from the north to the south along this ridge. And like I say, it falls slowly down. And the ridge ends really by the lower Galil, because the upper Galil and the lower Galil is like covers from east to west. But this ridge at the beginning of the lower Galil runs all the way down. We're going to go all the way to Hebron. So here are we're going to go from north to south. And again, this series of class is not a history class. I do mention things that happened in different places, but our whole point is to understand the spiritual geography. So the most northern of this ridge is Shechem. The Arabs call it Nablus. Shechem is the first place that we see that Avram Avinu came to when he came into the land. And he returned them there a number of times to Shechem. And that gives it great importance. Yosef Atzadik is buried in Shechem, which also makes it very important. Probably the key city of the northern kingdom was Shechem. That was like the headquarters. There were a few other places, but that was kind of the headquarters. Now, the geography there, which is very significant, is that Shechem sits right at the base of two mountains with a valley in between. And Shechem sits at the bottom of the valley. And those two mountains are called Har Eval and Har Grizim. Now, why this is so important is because in the book of Devarim, 2 different times, God commands that when you come into the land, you should go to these 2 mountains and renew the covenant between God and Israel in the land. Because up to now, God made the covenant with Avram, Yitzhak, and Yaakov in Eretz Yisrael, but then we went to exile in Egypt. And the coming out of Egypt, the giving of the Torah, wandering in the desert, that was all outside of Israel. So when we came into the land, God commanded us to go to these 2 mountains with the valley in between and to proclaim the blessing and the curse. And we don't have time to go through all of it, but it's in the 27th chapter of the book of Devarim, of Deuteronomy, all about what happened at these 2 mountains. And just in short, and again, this has to do with the geography. In other words, these 2 mountains were picked because of the geographical significance of having these 2 mountains very close to each other with this deep valley in between. And so the Levim and the Kohanim stood in the valley, and 6 of the tribes ascended to Har Grizim, and 6 ascended to Har Eval. And then in the Torah, there were blessings and curses that were proclaimed. And so Har Grizim was called Har Bracha. And to this day, there is a settlement called Har Bracha in that area, the mountain of blessing. And Har Eival was called the mountain of curse, only because that's where these 12 curses, which are written in the Torah, in the book of Devarim, in the 27th chapter. And it tells us which tribes went up to which mountain and how the whole ritual played itself out. And in the Torah, though, it only mentions the 12 curses. But we're told that the 12 curses also had 12 brachas. And then right after, this is in Parsha Ki Tavo, these blessings and curses are expanded. And this whole passages about all these incredible blessings that will come to Israel simply if we follow the Torah and cling to God. And the curses will come if we turn away from God and worship idols and don't keep the Torah. And we read this every year. And this is very connected to the geographical reality. And so it's very, very symbolic and very forceful, this whole picture of the blessing and the curse. And this is happening right outside of Shechem. Now, one time I was in Yosef, there was a yeshiva. Rav Ginsburg was the Rosh Yeshiva of, it was called Old Yosef Chai, literally in the, where he's buried. There were buildings around it, and the yeshiva sat right outside of the burial place of Yosef. And in the Intifada in year 2000, it was taken over, ransacked. Jews were killed, and to this day, even though in the Oslo Accords we technically have the right to run Yosef's tomb there, but now, for many, many years, no Jew is allowed to go there. It was too dangerous. And then the army started letting in every month, once a month, and about 1,000 people would go every month and to pray at the tomb of Yosef. So one time I was at the yeshiva with Rav Ginsburg, and we had a tour guide, and he took us in the area, and we went between the two mountains, and he pointed out these very, very ancient ruins. And he said, according to tradition, that these very ruins is the ancient city of Shechem, going back all the way to Avram Avinu. Some of the oldest archaeological finds in Israel. It was very, very awesome. And then I remember Rav Ginsburg saying, in the Torah, in Parshat Lech Lecha, there's what's called Brit Ben Betarim, the covenant between the pieces. And this is the first covenant that God makes with Avram. And the covenant is on the land, where God promises him, I will give you and your descendants this land forever. So it was a very, very important covenant was made, very symbolic. You have to read it in the end of Parshat Lech Lecha, or towards the end, not the end, but towards the end of Parshat Lech Lecha. Every part of it was extremely symbolic, but it doesn't mention where it happened. And so Rav Ginsburg said that there is a tradition that Brit Ben Betarim happened right there between the two, in the valley between the two mountains. And that, it makes sense that is why God then commanded when we came into the land, and Yoshua led us to these two mountains, and they did it. It's written in the book of Yoshua. We learned this. But this idea that we return to the place where Brit Bein B'tarim happened, the covenant with God on the land, I'll never forget this. I literally started like shaking. It was so awesome to stand in that place and to think that's exactly where God made the covenant with Avram Avinu. I was overwhelmed with emotion, absolutely overwhelmed with emotion. So that is Shechem. Again, many things happened in Shechem, but as much as possible, I'm sticking to the spiritual geography. Okay, so from Shechem, again, along this ridge, then you had Shiloh. Shiloh is where the Mishkan stood the longest. In other words, from the time we came into Eretz Yisrael until the time that the temple was built is approximately 400 years. I believe this number is correct, that for 369 of the years, the Mishkan was in Shiloh. So Shiloh was the spiritual center in a certain way until the temple was built in Yerushalayim and David made it capital of Israel. Shiloh was the spiritual place to go to, and the Mishkan was operating. Today, there is a settlement in Shiloh, and there are ruins that go all the ways back. Now, obviously, we don't have the Mishkan there. The Mishkan was hidden under the Temple Mount once the temple was built. But there are ruins going all the ways back to when the Mishkan was there. So it is obviously a very important place. Today, we call that area the Shomron. That was the place of the northern kingdom, was in the Shomron. And Shiloh was really in the northern kingdom. Yerushalayim was in the southern kingdom. From Shiloh, going south, then we have Beit El. We don't know exactly where Beit El is today, but we know it was north of Jerusalem. And this is a bit complicated, but this is where Yaakov had his dream of the ladder. That he named the place Beit El. But then there's a whole thing that was actually the Temple Mount. I'm not going to go into it now. It's a bit complicated. But Yaakov gave the name of where he had his dream as Beit El. When he fought with the angel, he was given the name Yisrael. But that was by an angel. It was an angel of God who gave him the name. After he defeated the angel, he faced off with Esav. He went through the whole episode with Shechem. Then God said, go back to Beit El. And there, God confirmed his name change from Yaakov to Yisrael. So Beit El is fairly close to Yerushalayim. And here, so this is in Parshat Vayishlach. It says like this. This is talking about God. It's going back over the dream that he had. And then it says, Vayatsev Yaakov Matseva. Yaakov, at the time of the dream, set up an altar, Bamakom Asher Diber Ito, in the place that God had spoken to him. Matzevet Evan, a stone altar. V'yasech aleha nesach, v'yitzoch aleha shemen. And he anointed this altar with oil. V'yikra Yaakov et Shem HaMakom asher diber ito sham Elokim Beit El. He named it Beit El. And then in a different place, when it's talking about Beit El, it says its ancient name was Luz. Now, I wrote a whole article in Fruits of the Orchard about this place called Luz. That we'll have to save perhaps for another time. So here, Shechem, Shiloh, Beit El. And then, of course, we get to Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim is like almost the middle of this ridge. We are going to come back to Yerushalayim and spend a substantial amount of time understanding the geographical realities of the surrounding mountains, the valleys, the streams, the caves around Jerusalem. And then, as we're going south, then we get to Beit Lechem, Bethlehem. That is where Rachel Imenu is buried. And there in the Torah, so it says that Rachel died in childbirth. And for various reasons, Yaakov did not take her to Hebron to bury her. He buried her right where she died. And so it says that she died. This is chapter 35, verse 19. It says, "V'tamat Rachel," she died, "v'tekaver b'derech Ephrata," and she was buried on the road to Ephrata. He Beit Lechem. This is Bethlehem. This is Beit Lechem. So again, this is all of these cities along the ridge for all of Jewish history. These were the main places. Shechem, I didn't even touch on all the things that happened in Shechem. The Mishkan in Shiloh, the Beit El, where Yaakov receives his name, Yerushalayim, and then to Beit Lechem. This was where David HaMelech was from. David HaMelech and his whole family were in the area of Beit Lechem. Shaul ruled close to Beit Lechem for part of his rule. So what's interesting now is right next to the city of Beit Lechem, which is an Arab city, at one point, only 50 years ago, it was approximately 80% Christian. Everyone knows Bethlehem from Christianity. Today, it's around 10 to 15% Christian, and not because of the Jews. It's because the Muslims have taken over Beit Lechem, and in many, many, many places in Israel, the Arab Muslims do not get along with the Christian Arabs. There's tremendous disagreements between them and tension. And so over the last 50 years, most of the Christians were kind of forced out because of the stress and the pressure and the sometimes violence. But what I want to mention is right next to Beit Lechem is the Jewish city called Efrat. And here you have in the Torah, it says She was buried on the way to Efrat. This is Beit Lechem. So when it was Rabbi Riskin was the rabbi at the Lincoln Square Synagogue in New York, a very, very famous synagogue. He, in a sense, made it famous. And he did an incredible thing in I believe it was the early 70s. He made Aliyah. He had a very prominent synagogue, well paid, well respected. He had everything that an American rabbi would want. And he went to Efrat and he started, there was nothing there. Nothing there. And he brought, I don't know the number, but a good number of families. They all made Aliyah together and they established Efrat. And geographically, Efrat is very, very unique. I call it the longest city in the world. I'm not sure how many people live there, around 20,000. In Israel, by the way, to be officially a city, you have to have 25,000 people. And then you get different governmental help. I think Efrat might have reached 25,000, but it is the same ridge that we're talking about. And on both sides, it falls off. And on one side, it's actually Arab. It's in what's called Yehuda. And so the whole settlement is along the top of the ridge, and it just goes and goes and goes and goes and goes and goes. It's very, very interesting how that works. It's a great place. A lot of English speakers in Efrat. So many people have made Aliyah to Efrat. And so the last one along the ridge that we're going to talk to, and again, as I said, tonight was just to be an overview, is Hebron. Hebron is pretty much the southern part of of this ridge. And then it descends into what we call the Negev. So I'll come back to Hebron in a minute. 40% of all of Israel is the Negev desert. It's a substantial part of Israel, 40%. And in 1948, when the state was established, I'm not sure when he moved there, but the first prime minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, so he and a group of people moved down into the Negev in a place called Sde Boker. And there was like nothing there. It's right by this incredible mountain range, desert mountain range. And he and his friends created this settlement. It's still there. And now Ben-Gurion University has a whole branch there where they do desert research. And so when he moved down there, everyone thought he was crazy. He's prime minister of Israel. And he moved like this to this totally isolated place. It took a substantial amount of time to get there from Jerusalem. In those days, there were not that many even roads in Israel, let alone cars. But he was a visionary, and he said the ultimate future of Israel has to develop the Negev. And so what is happening now is his dream is coming true. Beersheba, which is ancient times, and now it was always the most important place. Beersheba means the well of seven, or the well of promise. And that is because Avram Avinu, this is in Parshat Va'era, that Avimelech from the Philistines and Avram Avinu had good relations, but then it became strained, and it was kind of back and forth. So at one point, Avimelech understood that Avram is, he's actually called in one of the episodes, is the first time that the word prophet is mentioned in the Torah, and it's about Avram Avinu. And so he understood he was dealing with this incredible spiritual person. And so at one point, Avimelech comes to Avram and says, let's make an agreement between us. You won't bother me, I won't bother you. And Avram agrees to it. It was a bit controversial because later the sages questioned whether Avram should have entered into this agreement, because it was with the Philistines, and the Philistines became our major enemy. That's history. But here, why was it called Beersheba? So it says like this: when they made the covenant, so it says like this: Vayikach Avram tzon ubakar v'yiten la'Avimelech v'yichrotu shnehem brit. So Avram gave him sheep and cattle to Avimelech, and there they made a covenant. And then it says, Vayetzev Avram et sheva kavasot atzon lebaten. But he gave him these 7 sheep. And Avimelech said, why are you giving me these 7 sheep? And he says, these 7 sheep is like a witness of the covenant that we're making. Because in that place, Avram says, I sunk a well. And you have to know that this well is mine. And so they called the place Beersheba because of the well, but also because the 7 lambs, 7 is, the word is Sheva, but a promise, an agreement is called a Shavua. To swear is a Shavua. Later, Yitzchak dug wells, and so he also dug a well there, and he renamed it with the same name, Beersheba, because you have 2 different meanings for Beersheba. So here we're talking about the Negev, and so this is the northern Negev, and so Beersheba was always call it the headquarters of settlement in the northern Negev. We see that Avram spent a substantial amount of his time in Beersheba, really between Beersheba and Hebron. Those were really the 2 places. He started in Shechem, but then the rest of his life was in Hebron and in Beersheba. The Negev is desert, some beautiful mountain ranges, caves. In the winter, because the earth gets so hard from the sun beating on it, when it rains, the earth can't absorb the water. And you have these huge floods every winter to this day. Like these whole valleys fill up with, because they're surrounded by mountains and the water runs down the mountains, and the earth cannot absorb the water. and they show videos every year of people go out there because it's like incredible to see this water. Some of the water is then put in reservoirs. Some of it runs into the Dead Sea. A lot of it just, they haven't quite mastered what to do with it, but it happens every winter. And in the midway down the Negev is Mitzpe Ramon. And there you have the world's largest natural crater. Literally. Most craters are created by rain or earthquake. But this was a natural crater, mostly through wind, rain, just the earth moving over many years. And so Mitzpe Ramon it's a small settlement. Maybe there's 8,000-10,000 people there, probably at most. And it sits right on the rim. I try to go down every year. Some people call it the Grand Canyon of Israel. It's magnificent. And you can walk along the whole rim. It's just beautiful. And then there are trails that go down in to the valley, and then it rises up. And this is called Mitzpe Ramon. They're in Yerucham. Yerucham is another settlement in the desert. Also maybe 10,000-15,000 people. Has what's called the Great Crater, which is also magnificent. I've hiked down there many times. In the area, they have what's called the Painted Desert. They have this desert that has pink, purple, brown, tan, like all these different colors. Very beautiful. Different colors of purple. Very beautiful. And then it goes all the way down to Eilat. And that is the southern tip. Eilat is mentioned in the book of Kings by Shlomo HaMelech. Apparently Shlomo HaMelech had holdings in Eilat. He also sent boats out for trade routes. In ancient Israel, well, we'll call it the borders that are given in Parshat Maseh. Eretz Yisrael ends somewhere between Beersheba and Mitzpe Ramon. That was how far Yehuda, and inside Yehuda is Shimon. It did not make it all the way down to Eilat. That wasn't the smaller borders. The larger borders are, as we discussed, are from Egypt to Iraq, the Euphrates. So it's actually interesting because that came out this week in a very contentious interview that Tucker Carlson did with the American ambassador, Huckabee, in Israel. And he happened to have mentioned that the borders of Israel now are like the small borders. There are the larger borders. Well, it caused an uproar, as you can imagine. It caused an uproar in the Arab world, even mentioning this. Okay, so I think that's good for tonight. It was like just an overview, a survey of the whole land. In upcoming, and I believe, first of all, I have to mention, there's no class next week. Next Tuesday is Purim. Good Purim, everyone. So there's no class next week. And then from that time until I hopefully go to America for Pesach, There'll be 3 more classes, and I'm hoping to finish the series in those 3 classes. So just so you know what's coming up, we're going to deal with the 4 holy cities of Israel. We mentioned them tonight: Tzfat, Tiberia, Jerusalem, and Hebron. So hopefully we will dedicate a whole class to those 4 holy cities. And then we want to touch also on the Song of Songs. More than any other book of the Tanakh, the Song of Songs has the most beautiful descriptions and mentions of the geography of Eretz Israel. So we want to look at some of these verses and get a feeling of Eretz Israel through the lens of the Song of Songs. And then I also want to deal more with rain and water in Israel and the connection to agriculture and the Jewish holidays. So that's what we have coming up in our series on the spiritual geography of Eretz Israel.